There are many things about our world that are different right now.
The way we work,
the way we live,
and why we give.
One thing remains the same.
What we do together today
determines how we live united tomorrow.
The way Central Ohio rallied this year to help others is proof. Thanks to our generous donors, our Community Response Fund quickly reached more than $2 million.
It helps support more than 70 local not-for-profits and thousands of our neighbors in need.
But as this crisis continues, there's so much work to do.
It's the tough work.
The work that'll be needed to provide relief.
So our community can begin to recover and rebuild.
It's the very work that the United Way of Central Ohio does every day.
And has been doing for nearly 100 years.
We feed people facing food insecurity.
We connect people in crisis to resources that help pay bills and keep them in their homes.
We help prepare children for success in school, work, and life.
In a year that's been hard for many,
you can make a difference.
Give today to help people facing challenges with basic needs and education.
Give today to provide families relief and hope.
Give today to United Way's Community Response Fund.
Because what we do together today,
together today,
determines how we live united.
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 United tomorrow.
Good morning, and thank you for watching our video. I want to first thank everyone for joining us. I know it's early, but this is going to be an important conversation about racial equity and equity in general. My name is Shane Downton. I am the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer for the United Way of Central Ohio. And again, let me say welcome. I also want to thank our three panelists, whom I will introduce here in a few minutes. This conversation is a part of a week-long series of events that United Way is bringing to you entitled Rally for Recovery. Rally for Recovery is designed to energize and inspire all of you and our community, including our donors. We want you to take notice and to continue supporting the needs of the people that are most vulnerable in our community. United Way is also here to help. We started some of this work months ago when we focused on COVID-19 relief. With your support, we distributed over $2 million to local nonprofits who provided relief to people disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And now we're here to help keep the spirit and the momentum of support going. You can find out more about Rally for Recovery by going to our website at liveunitedcentralohio.org/rally. So, racial equity. The need for this conversation about racial equity is a theme that we've heard consistently from many of our partners across our community and our country. We have taken action to bring you this event today. Our panelists will be intentional about providing you with information to advance equity in your organization. And finally, I will say this. Everyone in our community should have equal opportunities to succeed. We have to challenge ourselves to ensure that happens. Brian Stevenson, the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama, says that 4 things have to happen to affect change when it comes to equity or racial equity. First, you have to get closer to the problem, meaning you have to do your homework and your research. Second, you have to stay engaged. You can't take a one and done approach. And third, we have to get a little uncomfortable. And then finally, the 4th thing, and this is one of the most important, we have to remain hopeful. So, for today's panel, in terms of the format, we will spend about 30 minutes hearing from the panelists on several questions about equity or racial equity in general. And then we will ask for audience participation and questions. Audience members can feel free to put questions in the chat box. We want to make this interactive and participatory. So let me introduce our panelists. First, we have Siobhan Boyd Nelson. Siobhan is the Director of Development and External Relations at Equality Ohio. Second, we have Jennifer Ingram. Jennifer is founder and CEO of Calibrated Lens. And third, we have Stephen Francis. Steve is President and Lead Strategist at Franchise D&I Solutions. So welcome to our three panelists, and thank you for joining us this morning. So the first question will go to Siobhan. Siobhan, Equality Ohio has been working against injustice for quite some time. You all have advocated for equality at a local and a state level. You have facilitated conversations and assisted coalitions in support of their goals to achieve equity. So my point is, you've been active in this work. Standing up and recognizing racial injustice or any type of injustice is hard, especially if you're in an environment or a culture that is somewhat new to this work. So I believe that standing up and advocating against injustice is the most important step. So the question is, how can associates or employees take an approach that is helpful to their employers, but is also a firm approach that is intentional and calls out issues of injustice and inequity that occur within their workplace or their culture?
Good morning, Shane, and thank you for that question. You're right, Equality Ohio has been advocating against injustice and been advocating for a more fair and equal Ohio, and that includes in the workplace. And we know that there are many people in the workplace who don't feel like their voice is heard and they don't feel like they are treated equitably. One of the things that we offer to employees who may feel like they don't have power in their role as an employee is first to understand what their own needs are. You have to know what your needs are and get really clear on those. We also advocate for finding buddies within your workplace. You are probably not the only person who is feeling that things are inequitable, who is feeling that things are less than fair. And we believe in the buddy system. We believe in reaching out to your coworkers and having conversations with them about what it is that would make a fair and equitable workplace. But we also recognize that this work can't be done at the employee level. We cannot put the onus on employees to make organization or systemic change. They can be part of the solution, but they can't own it all. So if your employees reach out to you, if an employee takes the time to say, I see something that is inequitable, I see something that is unfair for me or for my colleagues, there is a responsibility on the part of the C-suite to listen to that, to recognize the amount of courage that it took for that employee to stand up and to say that inequity out loud, to speak that truth to the C-suite, and then for the C-suite to act on those truths, to not just say, okay, we heard you, we're going to, or to have a conversation about it, but to really be proactive about taking steps to address what that employee is raising, or to find ways to be more equitable and more fair in that area that the employee has raised. And then here's the thing, it probably won't happen. You probably won't get people's attention the first time you speak up. Probably not the second time, probably not the third time, but we know that the squeaky wheel gets the oil, right? That we have to be consistent about these things. We have to be consistent about speaking out about them, about being verbal about the things that are inequitable. And the more consistent we are when we take that on, like I am going to be consistent about pointing out this inequity, we encourage others to start pointing out those inequities along with us. And we make it clear to those who are in positions of power that this is not a fad. This is not something that we are going to say once and it's going to go away, that this is real and that it needs to change, and it needs to change in systemic ways.
Thank you for that, Siobhan. Very well said. And I love the fact that you mentioned earlier that you have to understand your own needs. So what is your goal in these conversations, or what is your goal in trying to build that support for equal opportunity or for equity? And I also like the fact that you mentioned this. You said buddies, allies, buddies. What we know is that there is power and there's comfort in numbers, right? If you are not the only one, if you have people standing up with you, people usually take notice of that. And then you also said that there's responsibility on all sides, right? It just doesn't come from the top. It just doesn't come from the bottom, right? It's in the middle as well. So we all have to take an approach that is sort of not just a one-way street, but we have to take an approach where we are supporting each other. And then finally, it does take time to get attention, right? It takes time, and so you have to keep at it. And like I said, it goes back to what I said earlier about not taking a one and done approach. So Jennifer, Steve, do you have anything to add to that?
She did such a great job.
Oh, go ahead, Jennifer.
I was going to say she did such a great job. There are many points that I want to build off of in future questions, but I totally agree with all of your sentiments. I think that understanding the employee role in transforming an organization is such a critically important element to highlight and be mindful of as you think about the energy expenditure and what you are placing on employees that are oftentimes already taxed, already having disparate outcomes and experiences, being able to as an organization set them up for success versus re-traumatizing or overextending them is so important. So just excellent points.
Yeah, if I could just chime in, she stole a lot of my talking points too. Thanks a lot, Siobhan. But the thing that I wanted to emphasize is that ground up, bottom up, top down is what has to happen for equity to exist. It can't happen just in a centralized or remote, diversity office or whatever. And the power of the people, right? An example that we've seen just recently is the power of the NBA basketball players to just sit down. And I submit that the college players have significant power. The masses of money that they bring to colleges and universities for them to have mainline operations, and the appropriation upon their names, the jerseys and all that's sold, the merchandise, they have power. And so they need to wake up and understand how to use that power to get equity, not only in sports, but in classrooms. And again, I just think it's a great discussion and great kickoff by my sister that stole a lot of my talking points.
Thank you for that, Steve and Jennifer. So Jennifer, we're going to go to you for the next question. So Jennifer, and you already know this, but one of the things that I absolutely love about you is that you are great at making equity a part of a business so that it has future relevance, right? Equity has future relevance. So for everyone that is listening, talk about strategies that are tangible and actionable for a company to take that will not only strengthen their race equity work, but it will cement that work into the fabric of their culture.
Thanks so much, Shane, for having me today. It is such a pleasure to be with you all. Thank you for tuning in. I think it's important to first start by highlighting the work of Calibrated Lens. We work with organizations to transform their practices, policies, procedures to ensure that they are centering equity. It is really important to understand the difference between a programmatic approach, having conversations, having events, and doing the work. So again, looking at risk mitigation and harm reduction first. I touched on that just briefly when I mentioned oftentimes we are overtaxing certain segments of our workforce or our employee base. How are we talking about the issues and understanding the need to frame these issues around assets versus deficits is a really important starting point. And mitigating risk. Many organizations are, you're seeing them in the headlines. Starbucks was in the headlines again over the past few months after shutting down their offices for unconscious bias training 2 years ago after they had a huge, very public event. And so what I want to start by saying is that training in isolation does not transform your organization. Addressing things at an individual level does not transform your organization, nor is it sustainable. And a really simple example I'll give is if you think about the rate of attrition within an organization, if you are judging your success of a program or of your efforts by saying you trained 100% of your staff and you've got a 10% attrition rate, realizing that over the next 5 years, half of that workforce is likely to be gone. Right. And so if we are not looking at transforming the systems while also simultaneously bringing our people along in that journey, we're not doing the work. We are not setting our organizations up for sustainable change, which is what we all know that we need. If we think about how diversity and inclusion work started, it was birthed out of crisis. Right. The fact that we, came from the Kerner report and managing affirmative action plans, and then looking at that next iteration of understanding the need to incorporate tenets of inclusion. Beyond tenets of inclusion, we are now at equity, realizing that those are three very different words requiring three very different strategies. If you are an organization that has a diversity, equity, and inclusion program, the first question I'll ask is, how did your program change when you added equity to that equation, probably within the last 5 years? How did your resourcing and allocation change when you added equity? Because those tactics to drive creating a more equitable organization are very different than just having an inclusive organization. If we're talking about equity, we have to be explicit. Are we talking about gender equity? Because if we're talking about gender equity, that's a very different approach than if we're talking about racial equity. And if we're thinking about racial equity, we cannot move forward with instances of addressing racial inequity without the acknowledgement of past harms. Right now, does that mean necessarily going through and drudging up all of your employee grievances over the last 10 years? No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm highlighting is the fact that understanding and acknowledging the impacts of racism, be it institutional, structural, interpersonal, but starting to parse these things out and get beyond looking at these issues as being good or bad, or just solely staying at an individual level. Another way to cement this, I would say, is expectation setting. How are you talking about this within your organization? How are you communicating with employees, and what can they expect of you as an organization? And in turn, what can you expect of them as a workforce? I'm so glad that, and to expand a bit on what Sabine mentioned earlier around employees, many organizations have employee resource groups. These are not organizations or groups that should be transforming or fixing your organizations, right? You have to make the investment in ensuring that you have people that are able to drive the necessary strategies to produce the desired outcomes. And oftentimes I'll say that, folks approach this from one of three ways. People are passionate about the topic, right? People share their own lived experience. And the third that is also most rare is practitioners of the work, like us on this call today. Understanding to be a practitioner, you have assessed, you have researched, you have studied, you understand that there are levers that drive organizational change and how to influence and impact the change. I think, again, when we look at just keeping this at the employee level, it is not an appropriate expectation of an organization to expect employees to change. Employee resource groups and diversity committees within your organization do not oftentimes possess the skill set necessary to produce the desired outcomes. Can they help you get there? Absolutely. But in isolation, will that produce a more equitable and inclusive organization? No. And I'll share with you why. If you think about driving a culture of accountability, how you produce a culture of accountability is by, again, Stephen mentioned that top-down, bottom-up approach. But how are you holding leaders in between accountable for the desired outcomes that you'd hope to see as an organization? How are you investigating and leaning into those opportunity zones that you may learn about, be it from employees or trends? How are you assessing and evaluating your data? What are the measures or indicators of success or KPI, key performance indicators that will let you know if you are truly making a change at an institutional level? Many folks do employee engagement surveys, and this is where I'll start to transition into the equity conversation a bit. Are you disaggregating your data? And if you are not disaggregating your data, that's step one. When you think about disaggregating your data, are you understanding where there are gaps and or disparate outcomes or experiences across demographic groups? And if you have gotten to that point, that next step is how are you understanding or transforming your systems? How are you addressing those issue areas where you see gaps in opportunity? Shane, can I touch on a couple of other points, or do you want me to stop? I know you said we had 7 minutes.
Jennifer, this is great stuff. Keep going.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. I'll ask for permission because I know myself. I'm mindful of my voice. Another, I think, important component is looking at normalized behavior. In many organizations, we have normalized problematic and oftentimes offensive and sometimes discriminatory behavior. And just because it has been okay in the past does not make it okay today, especially in this current climate. As an organization, going back to expectations, how can your employees expect you to respond to instances that we have normalized that we know may not be right, or we know may not be equitable, or we know may not be inclusive, solely riding on the fact that we've always done it that way? I think if nothing else, COVID-19 and the need to rapidly transform and be agile in response to this global pandemic has taught us just because we've always done it that way doesn't mean that we have to continue to do it that way. And so with many of my clients, I'm asking the question, what are the things that you've learned during this period, and how might you continue on with those things in the future? Realizing the need to shed some things and adapt and evolve in other areas. And then last but not least, I think that understanding that this takes time, but beyond realizing that this work will take time, it's a marathon, not a sprint. How are you setting yourself up for the long game versus solely relying or falling back on those immediate or quick wins? What I will say is that many organizations have put out public statements in the past 3 to 4 months. Beyond a public statement, some organizations have sent out internal communications, right? Those are great, like level 0.1 steps, right? But moving beyond statements to starting to do the work. When we think about, the need to pace ourselves and create action plans that hold individuals within your organization accountable, but also help to inform what individuals should be doing. I think that the next thing that we're seeing a lot of right now, and going back to pacing yourself, is employee conversations, highlighting that these are safe spaces to have conversations, realizing that for people from marginalized identities, oftentimes these are not safe spaces. Safety is relative based on the individual, and historically these things have not been safe, and realizing that you may be able to create a container within your organization to engage in a conversation, but when those people go back to their work units, When they go back to the broader organization, what are the accountability measures that you're putting in place to ensure that they're not receiving, retaliation for their comments or being, ostracized or, targeted on the back end because of something that they may have said in a safe container or safe space that you created. And so again, looking at these steps that we're seeing that have become very popular, I just want to highlight where there are potential pitfalls in those instances, while also letting you know that that's not the end, that is only the beginning.
Wow. So that is all great stuff, Jennifer. And truth be told, the hairs on my arms were standing up because there were many truths in everything that you said. And, and this is the reason. So for those of you that are out there listening, I hope that you are taking notes because Siobhan and Jennifer both have had some great stuff to say in the answers to their questions. And I know that you all out there that are listening, I know that you're going to have questions here shortly. So I'm going to move forward to Steve Francis and ask him a question. And then we'll do some round robin question and answers with the panelists. So Steve, you and I have known each other for quite some time. Right? Yes. And I know you very well. And I know that you are a person and a man that likes a lot of action without a lot of talk. Right? So you've been in cultures where diversity, equity, and inclusion was compliance-based. And we both know that that works for a little while, right? But in reality, it's really not a good look for any organization to take a compliance-based approach to equity work, let alone racial equity work, right? So I'll get to the question so that our audience understands. How did you navigate the perception or the compliance-based approaches to equity work, diversity work, or inclusion work, whether or not if a company or organization was simply interested versus being truly, truly committed, right? And then secondly, what is your advice for any organization that wants to intentionally lead with equity?
Well, thank you, Shane. And first, I want to just comment on Jennifer. I mean, I can't believe she dropped all that knowledge for free. But the one point I want to get across is diversity costs money. I tell my clients this all the time. Just like any other frontline imperative of our organization, it costs money. You weed it, you feed it, you grow it. And my firm, Franchise D&I Solutions, our slogan is, we provide diversity and inclusion strategies to advance organizational missions and goals. Now, strategies, missions, and goals, those are key terms. It assumes that the organization approaches DEI from a strategic lens. As has been said, diversity, equity, and inclusion cannot be transactional. It must be institutional, right? It must be baked into and integrated into your cross-functional organizational planning and operational structure. And so if you transactionalize it, it's just a reaction to a George Floyd, or a reaction to a, fill in the blank public pressure issue. You talk about compliance-based. The diversity and equity and inclusion profession, by and large, has grown out of lawsuits and other external pressure points that have forced organizations to scramble around and do something to deal with this diversity and equity inclusion thing, right? And so one example is, and I can name names of corporations, major corporations that have reacted to lawsuits and established diversity and inclusion leaders and departments. But back before the Great Recession in 08, 09, I'm a lawyer, and so a lot of law firms were developing positions for the first time for diversity director and diversity manager and chief diversity officer of law firms. And it was because those law students basically started out at Stanford University, demanded that the law firms that they were going to work for embrace diversity, equity, inclusion, or else they were not going to work for those those top tier law firms. They were going to take their talents, as LeBron James says, somewhere else. And so the pressure was on the law firms. Hey, if we're going to get the top talent that demands diversity, we need to hire a diversity and equity inclusion director. Well, what happened? The recession hit. And so all of a sudden that population of diversity leaders in law firms disappeared because they prioritized the survival over, again, this diversity, equity, inclusion thing. You know, one of the things that I wanted to comment on, we say at Franchise D&I Solutions is diversity is a fact, inclusion is an act, and equity must be exact. And so it chimes into a lot of what has been said. Diversity is a fact. As long as folks continue to have babies with folks that don't look like them, or adopt babies that are from China, et cetera, we're going to have a diverse society. No walls or laws can prevent the inevitability of diversification of this country, period. You get beyond that, and again, it's the 12-step process. The first step of the 12th step is admitting that diversity is an imperative, right? Once you get past that, inclusion is an act. You can't just say, we're an inclusive organization, and snap your fingers and poof, you're inclusive. No, you have to have affirmative action to make sure that, and I like to say it like this, you've heard of being invited to the table. Well, don't invite me to the table after the table has already been set, right? I want you to invite me to have discussion about how we should set that table, what we should talk about, what we should eat, so that I can play a role in the strategic underpinnings of the discussion. And then equity must be exact. I think Jennifer said this. You need to have specific action that suits the needs of each employee where they are. And so it not only takes action, it takes strategic, targeted action, effort that goes above and beyond just going through the motions, and connect with each employee to meet them at their specific equitable needs, right? And so it takes work. There's another saying that's in the diversity space that I've improvised on. What gets measured gets done, right? When I was chief diversity officer for the city of Columbus, Mayor Ginther used to say, what gets measured, if you don't measure it, you don't mean it. And I mean it, right? And that's a great slogan. But even before that, I like to say, what gets funded gets measured, right? And so that gets back to the principle that diversity costs money. You have to fund diversity inclusion. And by God, if you put that investment in it, you're going to have people that are going to be watching that like a hawk to make sure they get the biggest bang for their buck and that their money is well spent. So the first step is to change the mindset that diversity is valuable and it leads to your competitive advantage of success. So you must fund it. Moving from statements to action. I've been helping clients craft commitment statements, right? And reacting to the George Floyd, et cetera, social and restorational justice. And so I collected a lot of these mission statements, and they have all this flowery, beautiful language. I mean, you can play your violin in the background, right? However, we don't want corporations to stand with us. We want them to employ us. We want them to promote us. We want them to do business with our minority businesses. We want them to develop policies that are in line with our diverse and equitable needs. So don't just have flowery statements, have action that has timelines tied to it so that your organization can hold you specifically accountable for what you're going to actually do in your organization to eradicate racial injustice or racial bias. I call myself the lead strategist, right, of my firm. And I believe that everything begins and ends with strategy and planning. And I got that from my days of leading diversity inclusion at Honda. They measured everything, they planned everything. In fact, they had analysis paralysis, they overplanned, I believe. but that's the nature of the organization. But I believe that you must plan. Uh, you can't be ready, shoot, aim. And so I ask clients, if you had all the money in the world, what one thing would you do to advance diversity, equity, inclusion? And if you had a deficit, a budget deficit, what one thing would you do to advance diversity, equity, inclusion? And then I ask a rhetorical question: should or could those two things be the same? In other words, if you had all the money and hardly any money, could that one thing or should that one thing be the same? And it's rhetorical because it depends upon what your strategic DEI plan tells you. After you swatted it, after you've developed goal themes and put action plans, timelines, resource allocation, responsible people, and determine which is the biggest threat, existential threat to your organization, which is your biggest weakness, et cetera, your strategic plan will tell you. In fact, that one big thing to advance equity may cost little or nothing, or it may require you to marshal resources from other parts of your organization to make sure that you prioritize that one thing that is the biggest threat to your existence. And so that's the way I've approached my work. And equity, again, must be exact. That takes effort. And it's just not a roll out the bed in the morning and give it lip service. There's other things that I again, have heard that I amen to, but I'll yield to you, Shane, to get this thing back on track, because I know we've been talking a lot.
Thank you for that, Steve. And I'll tell the three of you as panelists, the three of you are getting some great shout outs. And so, we're getting some snap fingers. You're doing an absolutely fantastic job. And I would say that you're laying down the law when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I do have a more general question, and it's something that I have always been curious about. And it's something that I typically talk about, which is, what is it about diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially equity, but what is it about those three things that makes us uncomfortable? Like, what is it? Because when we start talking about one or all three of those things, we get those butterflies in our stomach, right? And so sometimes, I think in my mind, is it me? Or is it the context of the environment that I'm in that makes me feel uneasy, right? So I wanted to throw that out there to the three of you to just get some reaction.
If I can jump in, I love this question, Shane, and I did want to bring up the idea of culture, and I think that that's what you're speaking to. That's one of the things that we focus on at Chroma Consulting, which is a social enterprise of Equality Ohio, where we do LGBTQ D&I training for organizations across the state. And we believe strongly in the power of culture. In fact, we talk a lot about dominant culture and the habits of dominant culture. Sometimes this is also called white supremacist culture and the habits of white supremacy. And that might sound, whoo, that got real fast, right? But here's the reality. Culture is what you swim in every day. It is dominant because anything that is different from that culture makes us uncomfortable. And one of the habits of dominant culture is that we don't push up against what we know and what what middle ground is. So here we are in reality, here is society, and we don't talk about race. We don't talk about inequity. We don't have honest conversations about these things because the dominant culture has taught us that that is uncomfortable, and that if nothing else, the dominant culture needs to be comfortable. Okay, if there's nothing else that we are taught in America, it is don't make the dominant culture uncomfortable. And so the reality is, if we are going to change culture, which is so much of this DEI work, right, is going up against the culture and changing the realities of our culture in order to make it more equitable for those of us who have been marginalized in our culture, some folks are going to have to move over and get a little bit uncomfortable. But changing culture, we swim in it. It's so difficult to change. And so I just want to highlight a few things building off of what Jen and Stephen have said. Stephen said, weed it, feed it, grow it. And I love that. I love that because you have to pay attention to it. And I think that this is also with your culture. If you are trying to change culture, you have to weed, feed, and grow the type of culture that you want. You can't just allow what has happened to continue. You have to invest dollars, time, learning, and resources into actually transforming that culture. I'm an athlete. My son's an athlete. We run. And one of the things that my father, who is a coach, has dug into my brain is what you do in practice is what you do in competition, right? So those of us who are trying to change culture, if you're in an organization and you're trying to lead this cultural shift in your organization, you can't just walk into work at 8 a.m. and say from 8 to 5, I'm going to be this cultural shifter. Right? You have to actually be living this in your life. This has to be a practice that is changing you as a person. Your ideas and the way that you approach the dominant culture has to shift in all areas of your life if you expect to walk into your workplace and make a shift there. What you do in practice is what you do in competition. This can't be transactional. You can't walk in between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. and be an equitable and inclusive person, right? If you're an equitable and inclusive person, you've got to practice that 24/7 across your life. And that means being honest about race, having conversations about inequity, having conversations about privilege outside of the workplace with those who are in the rest of your life. And when you start to do that, when you make that decision, that is a choice point. And when you make that decision that I am going to be a more equitable and inclusive person, then you've made a shift. And then you can start to see some results when you are in the workplace. And then I also just want to say that data is so important, and don't get caught there. Believe your employees, because your data is going to show you the tip of the iceberg. And I just want to be very clear that the traumas and the realities that marginalized people live with cannot all be captured in data. And what is going to create a more equitable and inclusive culture in your workplace is believing marginalized people. Believe them when they tell you that they have not been treated right. Believe them when they tell you that that something isn't working for them or that something is harmful. Don't just believe numbers and data. Believe your people, because those are your greatest resource. And once you start believing your people, again, I see that as one of those markers that you are actually creating a more equitable and inclusive workplace.
I love that, Siobhan. But thank you for that. Thank you for passing on that wisdom. And Jennifer, I know you and Steve want to jump in. We do have a question. So I'm going to ask you and Steve to jump in, but if each of you could limit your comments to about 2 minutes, so I can get to some of the questions that are being posed by the audience.
Absolutely. I think that, so at Calibrated Lens, we say that we prioritize people over process. Understanding that we all have processes and procedures in place, but to the earlier point, trusting and believing in your people. Earlier, a few months ago, we put out a piece called Exploring Differences, Reducing Harm, Evolving Strategies that I believe will be made available to this group. And what I will say is that oftentimes, when I go back to talking about the normalized things and behaviors that we have institutionalized, we in many instances talk about inclusion, but what we are actually promoting is assimilation. And I'll kind of unpack that. When we talk about inclusion, allowing folks to show up as they are and engage within an organization without necessarily changing the conditions to accommodate for that individual, when they do show up authentically, saying, well, we've always done it this way, or you're looking solely at representation around the table, but not creating a space that truly makes space for differences, for different perspectives, for folks to share all of who they are. Oftentimes we look at people in isolation of what they were hired to do versus looking at the fullness of who they are and all that they could bring to an organization. And the last thing, just to keep my comments brief, as it relates to, and this is going to be a comment that I'm sure will be a bit controversial, but I have to say it. Would you, when you think about your organization and your business imperatives, Would you hire a chief financial officer that was passionate about numbers, that managed their family budget in isolation, but did not quite understand the nuances of accounting, standardized accounting, right? So when you think about your diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, how are you ensuring that the people that are leading this work have the necessary skill set to drive change within an institution, looking solely at saying we have the position without ensuring that the individual is set up for success and has the necessary skill set is a miss. And it's I wouldn't even say a potential pitfall. It could be catastrophic to your organization, to your brand. And the last thing that I'll add there is looking at what it means to bring in support, resourcing this work as if it were a financial operation, your operations. It is the same. If you are to make progress, it's approaching it as a business imperative.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Steve?
Yeah, that's so important, Jennifer. What I wanted to do was just make a couple of comments. Schemas, implicit bias, how our mind works. Schemas has our minds constantly seeking comfort, safety, and convenience, right? So that's a biological reality. And that's why we avoid those difficult conversations. And that's why we stray away from those things that are strange or different from what our orientation is. And so we have to work at it. We have to work on identifying our biases and managing them so that they don't cloud our decisions, prevent us from engaging those differences. I like to say, in the face of differences, be curious. Don't be repulsive. Here's an example. At one organization I used to work at, they managed by avoidance, right? They just felt that if I avoid the issue, it'll go away. And that couldn't be anything further from the truth, and that makes it much, much worse. So we had to work with them to not manage by avoidance, but lean in and connect with the equitable needs of that associate so that they could get the resources, tools they need to be successful. We had Tim Wise come in to talk to our diversity committee at Honda when I was diversity leader. And you all know that he's a leader on white privilege. A white guy talking about white privilege is great, right? But he challenged our diversity committee years ago. He said, look at all your policies and question them. I like to say this to my clients. Leaders must not only ask the right questions, but question the wrong answers. So a wrong answer, to Jennifer's point, is that's the way we've always done it, or that's the way it's always been. That's the wrong answer, and leaders have to question that. And so, example, job description, minimum of 5 years of experience in. So Tim Wise had a mental exercise with our diversity committee, and he said, why 5 years? What about the diamond in the rough that had 4.5, 4.75 years? You're going to just summarily dismiss that candidate who could be the best, the rock star? No, look at these policies and ask why 5 years. And then the answer usually is, well, that's how many years the current leader had to be in that position. And that has to be the standard, the gold standard of success. No, that's irrelevant. And that speaks to equity. What exactly does the organization need? They may need street smarts more than book smarts, or they may need that 4.5 experience plus the common sense versus the 5.5 years experience with no common sense, right? And so again, it's not rocket science, but it is natural. It's that schemas that kicks in and causes us to stray away from the difficult things and seek comfort, safety, and convenience.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate that. So we've got quite a few questions from folks in the audience. So I'm going to jump right in and get to those. So we've got one question out there that basically says, you all are amazing. You're doing an absolutely fantastic job. And so got a person that is curious about hearing your thoughts about the executive order that was just signed last week, and what your thoughts on about how it will impact the ability of federal contractors to educate and to advance racial equity work?
Well, I will say I don't know specifically about the executive order, but I'll just use the local state and local laws that were recently passed declaring racism as a public health crisis. Now, I submit that racism is causing more than a public health crisis. It's a housing crisis. It's an education crisis. It's a food desert and nutritious crisis. It's a literacy crisis. It's a black on black crime, whatever. The list is too long. So we take the opportunity for laws like this or resolutions like this or executive orders to inform how they draft this law so that it does address all the underpinning landscape of social determinants for this type of situation we call racial injustice and systemic racism. Not just focusing on it being a public health crisis, but using this is the first, and I'm a lawyer, this is the first time, and Siobhan, you appreciate this. This is the first time in my legal history of over 30 years that I've seen legislation have the word racism in it, period. And so this is a great opportunity for us to capitalize on this. The door's been cracked open. We need to kick it in and be experts at the table and inform them on how they can really develop legislation to address racism from ground up, top down.
Thank you for that, Steve. So there's another question out there, and it speaks to the comments that you all made about funding and the importance of making sure that DEI work is well resourced. So there's a question that says, their company has a lot of volunteer groups that work with the diversity and inclusion team within their organization. And but the executives and paid professionals are not numerous. So the point is they seem to rely more on grassroots, sort of more of a top-down approach rather than a bottoms-up or kind of meet me in the middle approach. So what advice do you have to change any of that?
I think going back to my earlier point around expectation setting, the role of a chief diversity officer of a diversity and inclusion team is not to own the work in isolation. It's to be a strategist to create the mechanisms for the organization to do the work. Right? If you think about what a successful program looks like, it's not having a 20-person DEI team. It's ensuring that everyone within the organization is taking a sense of ownership and held accountable for upholding a culture of equity and inclusion. And so I think that it's, again, understanding the role of your formal D&I team and also looking at the volunteers, at the grassroots level that are so important to operationalizing this work. It is not to be done in a vacuum or at the top of an organization. It should be leader owned if you are to, again, transform and have this sense of inclusion and equity. This is everyone's job. And assigning a role to everyone, and again, having someone from a formal D&I team, and I will say this, they are oftentimes overtaxed, overstretched, and way too small to do the work. So I don't want to give the impression that it's not that. It absolutely is. But again, going back to my earlier point, if we are approaching this as a business imperative, we need the resourcing to do the work within our organization, but also realizing that just the head count in isolation won't necessarily produce the desired outcomes, in my opinion.
Absolutely, absolutely. So do any of you have strategies or starting points when speaking with people that don't see the value in DEI? Right, there's that continuum approach where people are unaware.
I ask clients whether it's an initial meeting with the board or ELT or in a workshop. I ask them, raise your hand if you believe in capitalism. Everybody raises their hand. And I said, you've just demonstrated the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion. I said, because capitalism has been driven by increased market share, increased buying, you tap into the buying power of emerging populations, which are by and large diverse. You get the most creative and innovative product development for those breakthrough solutions that nobody else has, and therefore you're more successful than others and you make more money. Capitalism is the business case for diversity and inclusion. And now they have a term called conscious capitalism, which I've been preaching, which also feeds into the success or the business case for diversity, equity, inclusion. If you don't focus so much on bringing in profit, but giving out your resources to support philanthropically those disadvantaged and marginalized communities, the intangibles and the indirect benefits will be huge, and they will be loyal to your organization in ways that are unimaginable. So I think capitalism is the business case for diversity and equity inclusion. It's just changing mindset shift.
And the other point that I wanted to just add on this, did Blockbuster believe in streaming services? As we think about evolving with the times, being a responsive organization to external pressures, and we're agile and responsive in other ways, this is no different.
That is a really good point, Jennifer. So we have about 4 minutes left, and really about maybe 3.5 minutes left. So I'm going to give each one of you 1 minute to kind of provide any parting thoughts to our audience members. And we can start with 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Steve, we'll start with you, just trying to give you time to think.
I was just trying to collect my thoughts. That's all right. I really appreciate the opportunity. I hope that those on the call have benefited from this discussion. I'm recovering from ankle surgery, and so I'm sitting here with my knee caddy, with my foot propped up. But that's an example of equity. I'm still able to support and provide strategies to hundreds of people by sitting here in my home. And so I really want everybody to just really think of equity on real basic terms. Don't make it harder than it has to be. It's almost like the platinum rule, do unto others as you would have them, do unto you, or however that platinum rule works out. Just think about others first. I like to have seminars on inclusive leadership. And one element of inclusive leadership is that altruistic leader, right? The one that you would kill a rock for. And I'm sure you know it's hard to kill a rock, right? So if you have a sense of loyalty and support for the needs of your associates or your employees, they will be loyal. They will kill a rock for you. They will fall on the sword for you. And that will bring untold benefits to you and the organization and to the associate.
Thank you, Steve. Siobhan?
This work is hard, and it's worth it. I mean, it is so worth it, because you are, as folks have said here, you are going to see the results. The culture is going to change in your workplace, and it's going to change for the better. Workplaces are where we spend so much of our time, and yet we believe that we walk into a culture that just is, and there's nothing that we can do about it. But we do have the power to change those cultures. It will take time, and we have to invite everybody on this journey. This cannot be a journey for a department. This can't be a journey just for a C-suite. It can't be a journey just for employees. It has to be your board. It has to be your C-suite. It has to be every single employee being invited on this journey. And when everyone is invited on the journey and has the opportunity to do this work together, you will see real change happening. And don't leave it at the workplace. When you shut that door, or, I mean, we're in our homes, especially if you're working from home, use that as an excuse to really make this change in our lives, and really change the way that we are approaching these things. And I just want to say, everyone should be responsible for their own learning. I hope that everyone has gotten super curious here about the wisdom that has been shared by Stephen and Jim, and wants to learn more and takes responsibility for their own learning. Don't put that on your employees. Go out and find it.
Jennifer, 20 seconds.
Diversity is happening, inclusion is intentional, and equity is deliberate. We are at an inflection point. Realize that the actions or inaction that we take today will become the history of tomorrow. When we look back at our organizations in 2020, will we be looking at where we were 20 years ago, or are we looking to the future and hoping to ensure that we are relevant to all folks moving forward? Thank you.
So let me thank our panelists and to everyone for joining us. Please check out the rest of the events and volunteer opportunities that we have planned for the week, this week in particular, at liveunitedcentralohio.org/rally. And we hope that you will consider giving what you can to the United Way of Central Ohio's Community Response Fund through our workplace campaign or on our website, because what we do together today determines how we live united tomorrow. Have a great day and thank you for joining us.